and welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. As everybody's well aware, the cost of living crisis is driving a wave of strikes across the country. There's also a growing concern about the government's social, environmental and foreign policies too, and that's led to an upsurge in direct action by protest groups. But instead of addressing the growing concerns of the public, the Tory government's pushing through two pieces of legislation that represent a fundamental assault on our civil liberties. These are the Public Order Bill and the so-called Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill. These bills seek to outlaw industrial action in much of the public sector and to criminalise public protest too. Now, joining us on the show tonight are two excellent guests who will be able to address, I hope, the growing impasse between the political class and the working class. I mean, we've got Ian Hodson, who's the national president of the excellent Bakers Union, and Phil Bevin, who's a former staff member in Jeremy Corbyn's office when he was the leader of the Labour Party. Ian, let me come to you first, because I know you've got to leave before the end of the show because of other commitments. But just want to ask really, can the trade union movement defeat this legislative assault on workers, if it becomes law, that is? And do you think the unions will comply with it if it does get onto the statute book?
Well, I think the trade unions have to defeat this legislation if to be able to defend their workers, to defend their members. If workers are to be defended in the workplace, then we have to defeat this legislation. I think it's highly likely that the legislation will pass, but by the time it passes, will these strikes have been resolved? That remains to be seen. But I think in the long run, the impact of this legislation would be such as to force public service workers to be forced to work. I mean, I often give speeches, Chris, and remind people that the difference between a worker and a slave is the right to enjoy your labour. But what this legislation will do will enforce public service workers, nurses, doctors, firemen, all of those essential workers that we went out and clapped to go into work and cross a picket line. And if they don't, they will face dismissal. I mean, that's just an appalling situation for any worker to be faced with.
I mean, I know in the 70s and in the 80s as well, I think. I mean, when I think unions had many more members, and in many ways, I think were stronger because of that. I mean, there were still, what was referred to as wildcat strikes. I mean, do you think that's a likelihood if the legislation goes forward?
Well, I mean, I've got to ask the question: what would be the point of having a legal ballot if you're not protected during a legal strike? I mean, I don't see any point in costing yourselves a fortune in firstly conducting that ballot, then having to meet those thresholds, when the outcome of that would be that you would face being sued anyway by your employer, and your members would face being dismissed. And as we've seen today, the government is offering £40 to people to cross a picket line, which shows that the money is there. So this is about removing workers' rights. This is about attacking and putting more costs onto trade unions anyway. And I think, we have to recognise that curling up in a ball and just being kicked won't stop because we curl up in that ball and allow ourselves to be kicked. At some point, we have to stand up and we have to say, actually, we're not going to play your game anymore. We're not going to follow your rules. And, if our members want to take action, then so be it, because we will not be exploited. We will not accept low pay. We will not accept having to rely on charity or people's goodwill to put food on our tables or to help us pay our rents, or have to live on a credit card. To meet the weekly bills. That's just not acceptable. And I think, for the trade union to be relevant to people's lives, then I think we have to recognise that type of action will be required.
It seems that we're going back, 200 years. I know we're not sort of talking about, well, they're not talking about transporting trade unionists just yet, but I wonder what the Tolpuddle martyrs and the pioneers of the labour movement, the trade union movement, would actually make of these retrograde steps that the government is taking.
I mean, it's horrific, isn't it? I mean, I went to the Indie Labour Fest and was speaking there about, you know, where we are as a working class and what we did at that particular point to create a political party that represented the interests of the labouring classes. And you know what we was faced with then was a Taft Vale judgment, of course, which put you know, the unions at risk because it allowed employers to sue them for any loss of income, because obviously you can't have these big capitalists losing money in a strike, but you can accept these big capitalist corporations to exploit workers and for them to you know, suffer, and you know, the community to suffer with their inability to afford to live a decent life. I mean, you know, I think the working class is being posed a question. I don't think it's just the trade unions. I think it's all workers. You know, it's all the people who live in our communities that are being, you know, told basically, we are removing your rights. We will remove your opportunity to defend yourself. So if you get harassed in the workplace, for example, there won't be anything you can do to defend yourself, because basically, if you and your colleagues take any action to defend yourself, well, we could sack you for doing so. So, I mean, you know, imagine going into a workplace and having to tolerate sexual harassment, because those are the types of things that normally lead to disputes. You know, when workers are harassed in the workplace or bullied in the workplace. I mean, nowadays, you know, the issue of pay is not normally the biggest reason for industrial action. Most of our strikes in recent years have been to do with sexual harassment. They've been to do with the issues of 0 hours contracts. They've been to do with the issues of health and safety.
Yeah.
Obviously, at this moment in time, the public sector issue, you know, after working through the pandemic, after being recognised as frontline workers, you know, accepting low pay increases, are now expected to pay for the billions that the government, you know, handed out to their mates. And the legislation is being brought in because this government is incapable of negotiating. It's because they've not got the skills that's required to sit down at a table and negotiate the terms and conditions of those absolutely incredible workers that save our lives on a daily basis. And I'm you know, I couldn't say enough in support, you know, of those, you know, the people who deliver our post, the people who can make sure that we don't burn in fires, and the people who make sure that if we go to hospital, despite what they're faced with, treat us with dignity and respect, even though there's so much stress and pressure.
I mean, I was we had like an impromptu demo in support of the health workers, nurses this morning in Derby, not at the workplace, but at a main arterial road into the city, and we had placards, you know, basically saying, you know, support the nurses, pay the nurses properly, etc. And the, you know, the support from passing motorists was absolutely overwhelming. There's huge support, I think, for the industrial disputes which are taking place now, which I think is, you know, is quite unusual actually, if, you know, compared. I mean, I think there's always been public support to some level, but I think now it's very, very significant. Is that something you've picked up, Ian?
I absolutely have, Chris, and you know, and I think, you know, the government has picked on the wrong workers.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we've just gone through, you know, an incredible, when you think about it, an incredible time when the whole of the United Kingdom was asked to come out onto their doorstep to support and applaud these people that were keeping us safe, keeping our loved ones, you know, free from death, basically.
Yeah.
And the government has chosen that they will be the target. They will be the new miners, you know, and I think they've called it wrong. And I think people can see through it, you know, and I think when the teachers go out, the impacts on the economy will be huge. And again, this is down to the fact that the people responsible, you know, for educating our next generation of scientists, of entrepreneurs, you know, of all those industrialists that we will require to keep the economy running, to make sure that we flourish in the future, are being told that their value is minimal. I mean, you know, you've got to invest in people, you know, make sure that we have a future and an economy that enables those of us who are still in work when we retire to be able to prosper.
Absolutely.
And we need those youngsters to be trained and skilled to be able to do that. And yet, doesn't.
I was going to say that to be fair, though, Ian, I mean, the government ministers did applaud the health workers, didn't they, during the COVID crisis? So that's something that they can.
I mean, yeah. I mean, obviously they can take that down to the bank and pay their overdraft with it.
I think that's right. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's the way to go. Well, I mean, I think what we could do is maybe give the utilities a round of applause rather than paying these bloody exorbitant energy bills.
That'd be great. I think that'd be great. You know, just as you know, obviously the idea that the people who are making this legislation, by the way, the people who are making this legislation in the face of the worst economic crisis that we've ever faced, are people claiming for their own energy, you know, not paying expenses to purchase food, and you know, getting free transport.
Double standards.
They can't catch a train, you know, they can catch a taxi instead. We pay for their homes, well, their second homes, while they rent out their first homes, and yet they're saying, you know, we can't afford to pay people who keep us safe.
Well, they can afford. I mean, that's just a myth. I mean, you know, Britain has its own sovereign currency, and literally, money is no object for the government. It can just create it. It issues the only impediment, frankly, to public spending is the availability of real resources in the economy. You know, the ability of the economy to absorb public spending, and then the government's got the instrument at its disposal of taxation. To if the economy overheats, it can tax the private sector to create the space for necessary public investment instead. But Phil, let me come to you. I mean, the government seems to be engaged in a pincer movement to me. I mean, on the one hand, you know, banning strikes, I've just been talking to Ian there about, and clamping down on public protests on the other. I mean, how do you think the trade union movement and wider civil society should respond, in your opinion, to these attacks?
Oh, that's a huge question. I think, I think it is a pincer movement. And just to kind of my perspective on all of this, I'm interested in kind of international affairs and looking at things from the bigger picture as well. So on your point on the economy, Chris, it's true that the government, we have a sovereign currency in the UK, and we can print as much money as we like. But Britain in the world today we're at a bit of a turning point, and we're in trouble as a country, but also as an empire linked up to the United States. Our access to markets is increasing relative to other countries. So as you get countries like China rising up, they have more economic power in the world, more leverage relative to the United States and Britain, and that is putting pressure on our access to resources. And so the domestic situation in this country is occurring in that context. And what we've had over, well, since 2008, so over a long period of time, we've now had quantitative easing, lots of money printing. But while we've been printing money, our access to resources has decreased. So there's more money going around, but it's actually buying the UK economy, the US economy, the dollar less. And so this is
the thing about that. The thing about that, though, Phil, is that the money was going into the pockets of the wrong people. I mean, what Corbynomics was about when Richard Murphy was advising Jeremy in the early days, but then it was quietly dropped. He talked about people's quantitative easing, and so rather than, as it were, you know, giving that, you know, creating that currency, I mean, they don't really print money anymore these days. It's just they hit a few keys in the treasury, as it were, and transfer money that way. Rather than sort of transferring the money into the banks, what Richard was talking about, what Jeremy was I mean, this is how the Corbynomics, the term Corbynomics came about. It was a pejorative term put forward by Chris Leslie, who was the former Shadow Chancellor. But I think it was, you know, it was then adopted as quite a snappy, quite a snappy strapline. But yeah, I mean, what they're talking about is use that quantity to actually to pay for real resources. Anything that's available for, you know, in your own currency. So they could have actually created the you know, improved the infrastructure, built the houses, and done all the other things, and, you know, proper pensions for people, etc.
But the issue is, I mean, I just I agree with that. One of the things that Richard Murphy said, actually, I believe, I'm not sure where his thinking is now. I'm kind of going on what he said in the past, but is that quantitative easing, it's best used, you only really need it in a period of crisis to kind of boost the economy in a period where things aren't going so well. Get money directly into people's pockets, as you say. And as again you said, the problem is what the government did, both Labour and Conservatives, is that they gave the money to the banks to underpin private sector lending to get us all into debt. So, and that was increased liquidity in the economy, increased spending through debt. So once again, we're all in a position where they've done all this money printing essentially to the point that they've maxed it out. And as a result, we're all in more debt than we've ever been again. And at the same time, the money isn't worth as much. So we're in a real mess. And the reason the money isn't worth as much is because we've screwed up our foreign policy as well. The wars have backfired and our international relations policy is terrible, which is why ever more countries actually are moving away from the West and going to China and even Russia. So so in terms of the domestic situation, the economic impact is significant. There's less resources to go around. And what the government is trying to do is find a way to claw back some of the value of the money that they've been printing, and by restricting the economy again. And because they've screwed up and they don't want to give up the money, they're putting it all on us. So
yes, I mean, ordinary people certainly shouldn't be painful. I mean, I think we probably could do with another program to talk about the whole kind of thing around the economy. But I mean, the reality is that most of the money, I mean, talk about borrowing, but most of the government bonds have actually been bought by the Bank of England. So it's actually the government borrowing from itself. So that's a pile of nonsense, really. But just going back to the point, though, just in relation to these two bills, though, Phil, and I know you said it was a big question, but obviously there's this pincer movement. They're attacking kind of civil society, they're attacking the wider civil society, also going after trade unions. I just wonder what you thought, just on that specific point. How should we ignore the law and
Well, I mean, I think my point is that because the problems that we're facing nationally and actually are a result of also of international policy as well, the government actually doesn't have any answers to them that are going to work in the immediate term. And so they're actually facing, our policymakers are facing a crisis of legitimacy that they don't know how to solve. And that means that things here in this country are going to get a hell of a lot worse before they get better, because since we can't get so many resources from elsewhere, we're cannibalizing our resources at home. So we've got the NHS set up and everything. And all throughout our society, people are struggling to access the things the basics that they need increasingly. And that's going to get worse and worse and worse. And so the government knows this. This is my view. The government knows this. And they're introducing these laws because they know that dissent is coming. They know that people are fed up, and they know that they're going to be in trouble, and they're trying to crack down and put the they're
implementing socialism for the rich, it seems to me, though. I mean, they talk about cannibalizing various public services, and maybe one of the things we should be doing is kind of raising political consciousness, because it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, we could properly nationalize the National Health Service. We couldn't. I mean, what they're trying to do is to maintain the income stream for the super rich.
That's exactly what they're doing.
And so I think one of the things, I mean, where I think the trade unions perhaps ought to play a role in terms of raising the consciousness, the political consciousness of their members. But Ian, because I know you've got a shoot in about 10 minutes, I just want to get a couple of other questions to you before you do have to leave. I mean, I don't know what you'd say about the Labour Party's response to the government's move so far on these pieces of legislation.
I mean, obviously they opposed it in Westminster, which is good, and it was good that Keir Starmer actually did say he'd repeal it. But I trust Keir Starmer to deliver on anything he says not at all. I mean, he was even questioned by that Laura Kuenssberg about the fact that he got elected on a set of values. I always thought values is what formed your opinion, But apparently, for the leader of the Labour Party, those values only formed your opinion at a moment in time. So the idea that although he's opposing it in Westminster at this moment, if he was to become elected, maybe that moment in time would have passed and he would have moved on, and we'd have some different values from Keir Starmer. So I'm not convinced that Keir Starmer would be true to his word, and I think the trade unions should take anything he says with a pinch of salt. You know, this is a guy that said he supported £15 an hour and then forced Andy MacDonald to resign for supporting £15 an hour at the conference, who moved the best employment policies that Labour's had in many a year, and that was formed because of consultation between shadow ministers and trade unions, and it's been dumped on. So I mean, anything that the Labour Party's got to say on it, I'm afraid I do not have any confidence that
if Sir Keir Starmer gets the keys to 10 Downing Street, I mean, you're not particularly confident then that he will repeal this legislation, or indeed the other anti-trade union legislation, which remained on the statute book during the 13 years that New Labour were in government. And Tony Blair was crowing about the fact that after the modifications, they did make some modifications, and Britain would still have the most restrictive trade union laws anywhere in the Western world, as if that was a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think they'll find the third way, Chris. It's a
neoliberal way. It's not really a third way. I mean, these guys are neoliberals to the core. Yeah. I mean, you know, Sir Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, West Streeting, they're all neoliberals. That's a bloody problem. That's what screwed us in this country, and indeed across the so-called Western world. Neoliberal economics. It's socialism for the rich and penury for everybody else.
I mean, that's why I mentioned at the beginning. You know, we were tasked in the early 1900s, you know, as a working class, about what we did about the poverty that we was expected to live in, the inequality in the society, the fact that we didn't have decent homes, the fact that we had to rely on charity. We was tasked with answering that question. Well, we're faced with the same question now, you know, in the 2020s. You know, we've got no decent home for people to move into. We've got, you know, poorer and poorer accommodation for people to live in. We've got low pay that doesn't enable you to meet the basic needs. And, you know, we've got two political parties that are offering the same solutions, which basically would maintain the current hardship that we're all suffering, will continue to blame minority groups. All right, you know, I mean, when you think about it, I mean, we've moved from, you know, it's been members of the EU and it's all the fault of those migrants coming over here and taking all your jobs and taking all your housing. Now it's the fault of 40 people coming over on a dinghy. You know, I mean, what sort of economy is it where 40 people on a dinghy can stop you from getting a house or decent pay to be able to put food on the table for your family? It's nonsense.
This comes back to the point about raising political consciousness, doesn't it? And one thing I used to always say on the doorstep is that, you know, if I come across somebody who held bigoted views, was that we as working class people have got more in common with migrants than we got with the people at the top of society in this country, who are very often the self-same people, the self-same interests, which are actually creating these circumstances which lead to people fleeing their own homes, because these people are part of the war machine. And, you know, we know that people, you know, the terrible consequences of war, and, you know, and if we could smash the war machine, then, you know, we'd have a much more settled world. But
we'd have money to pay for things, wouldn't we? I mean, I thought that was interesting the other day. I mean, the fact that the British Army is being told to send its tanks to Ukraine. You got the generals coming out saying, "Hey, if you send those tanks, we've got no military." I mean, you know, we've got the wrong priorities and the wrong solutions, and both political parties aren't interested in looking at an alternative.
They want to maintain the status quo. Actually,
they absolutely do. I mean, you know, we had a glimpse of how different life could be, you know.
We did.
Told the 1970s was a terrible period. Not for the working class, it wasn't. You know, in the 1970s, we were able to save, buy cars, go on holidays, buy homes. You know, we were.
I'm living proof of that, Ian. I mean, I've often made this point on this show, but I was an apprentice bricklayer in 1976, 19 years old. And me and my girlfriend, went on to become my wife, but she worked as a telephonist for the city council. We were able to buy a brand new 3-bedroom, semi-detached house in a desirable village backing onto a waterfront.
Now,
You know, and it was 3 times what I earned. I mean, ridiculous, you know. But
now it's
Phil,
a dream.
yeah, exactly, mate. And it shouldn't be that way, should it?
No.
It shouldn't. I mean, you know, those days, children could always look forward to a better quality of life, a better standard of living than the parents, and it's gone into reverse now. That's just totally unacceptable
And we have
for
to
a country that's got the 5th biggest economy in the world.
Yeah, and we have to remind people. I mean, you know, and politics is important. I mean, you know, politics is important, but the ability to get the message about the alternative politics is the part that you know. I know you try your best with Resistance TV, and obviously there's a lot of left-wing media out there, and obviously trade unions do try and get that message across. I mean, Sharon Graham's doing a phenomenal job with what she's been winning inside Unite, and obviously, you know, Mick Lynch and you know what he's been talking about, and Eddie Dempsey. I mean, they've been incredible.
I think these industrial disputes will help to politicise more people as well. Actually, I mean, that you know, that's another positive thing to come out of it. Let me just get another quick question to Phil, and one more to go to you before you've got to shoot off. But I just wanted to ask you, Phil. I mean, the Public Order Bill, as you know, contains some quite draconian measures, such as enabling the police to stop demonstrations in the tracks, criminalising people just for linking arms, for God's sake. Apparently, it's also going to be possible to limit activists' use of the internet, and it would even enable the state to electronically tag would-be protesters. Can you believe it? I mean, this level of authoritarianism.
Yes, we're seeing it everywhere in the West. We're seeing it everywhere.
It's unprecedented. Look, this level of authoritarianism, it's unprecedented in my lifetime. Is the establishment frightened?
Yes, terrified. Because it's like I say, they are desperate to protect their share of the wealth. At a time when the country's economy's access to wealth is declining, and in order to do that, they have to crack down, because people are getting fed up with giving ever more cash to the top. And so, yeah, they're absolutely terrified, and that's why they're bringing forward this legislation to put things in place so that when people do start to kick off, they have everything ready to start to throw people in jail. And this is the thing, is that, and just going back to your previous question, Chris, about, I didn't answer it directly, but should people break the law? My view is actually people at some point are going to have to, because they won't be able to protest or raise dissent within the law. So it's going to make this clash between ordinary people and the establishment inevitable. And that's not what any of us want, but that's what they're doing, and they're doing it on purpose. I also think they probably don't have the resources to enforce it properly. So it's going to be very interesting what happens over the next few years, but it's also very concerning.
But I mean, on another point, another tangential point, is in terms of the lack of resources. I mean, one of the things that even new Labour are saying now, with regard to the National Health Services, that the crisis in the NHS, what they're arguing, as you know, is can be plugged by the private sector, so more privatisation. But that's nonsense, because the vast bulk of private healthcare is provided by people moonlighting who work in the NHS. So it's not, we need to grow the capacity in totality, not to sort of rob Peter to pay Paul. That's just a nonsense thing,
They're doing the opposite. Like I said, again, it's this access to real resources declining, and so they're turning on our own resource base in this country because they can't exploit other countries quite to the extent that they could. And the NHS is the big one. That's why, there's all this talk of US buying out GP surgery contracts and all this kind of stuff. But what they're actually doing, rather than expanding the provision of public healthcare in this country, they are asset stripping it. So the coronavirus crisis was actually used as an excuse to get rid of hospital beds. So the NHS crisis isn't an accident. And this is something that people like Bob Gill are always saying. It is an intentional outcome of policy. You don't specifically remove people's rights to access to healthcare unless you mean to do that. And that's exactly what they've done. And so we're in this kind of economic crisis through crap government decisions and crap economic management across the West, but here in the UK
for,
as well.
which for 40 years, of course, as well.
For
Look,
40 years,
it's just 1:30 now, and I know Ian was going to go at 1:30, but let me just ask you one final quick question, Ian, before you do have to leave. I mean, the British government, as you know, is quick to support and even foment strikes and demonstrations in other countries that challenge Western imperialism. Yet here in Britain, as we know, as we've been talking about this evening, they want to outlaw industrial action and criminalise the sort of public protests that they venerate in other countries. I mean, that smacks of breathtaking hypocrisy to me. What would your concluding comments be about that level of hypocrisy?
I mean, well, I'm not surprised. I mean, the hypocrisy at the heart of this government. I mean, when you consider that, you know, the people who have been championing these anti-strike laws have been saying it's about bringing Britain in line with the European Union, I think it speaks volumes about where they're prepared to go. And I believe, you know, for decades, for centuries, you know, we you know, we're part of a country that believes you can bomb democracy around the world, but not practice this at home. I think it was Gandhi that once said that when we get it, it would be nice.
Yes, it's the Christmas civilization. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I'm the more astounding thing to me is how people are prepared to allow it. You know, that's the astounding thing to me, how people are allowing a government that wants to pretend by talking about freedoms, liberties and democracy is probably the most authoritarian and one of the most authoritarian governments, certainly in Europe and maybe in the Western world. And yet we believe somehow we are free and living in a democracy, and we're not. You know, and people need to wake up to that fact, because, you know, once they've run out of migrants to despise, once they've run out of poor people to demoralize and demonize, then they've got the middle class, and then what's left? You know, and people need to be aware of that, because it's not just our liberties that are being taken away, it's theirs too. And liberty, you know, is so important, a right for all of us as human beings, regardless of our race, our colour, or our religion. It's a right that we should be entitled to. But sometimes we're wrong with it, but sometimes we have to fight for it, and we will absolutely have to fight for it again.
Well, the French Revolution, I mean, you know, talked about equality, fraternity and liberty. I mean, and, you know, we could do with a bit of that in this country as well, couldn't we? Listen, Ian, I know you've got to shoot off, mate. Thanks very much indeed for taking the time out to come on. Really appreciate it. Yeah, best of luck, mate, in your
Thank you very much.
Ongoing. Yeah,
good luck.
Thanks, Cameron.
See you all soon.
Thanks
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
bye.
Cheers, mate. See you, mate. Yeah. Phil, just in the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes then, I mean, we just wonder whether you might say a bit about the, you know, the kind of burgeoning protest movement in this country, some of which have been the, you know, targets of this legislation. Some of the direct action organisations do some great work. Others, I mean, I just, you know, some I just worry that, and I know you've got some concerns, are you know, being you know, manipulated by, infiltrated by you know, dark, nefarious forces. I wonder whether you might sort of say a little bit about that.
Well,
I mean, how we can distinguish, you know, who's good news, who's a bit dodgy, you know.
Well, we'll just coming in off the back of your question to Ian about political education.
Yeah.
And I think it's with regards to these protest movements, actually, this is one of the really kind of interesting aspects. One of my academic expertise is narrative. And I'm interested in how you differentiate between them is kind of the stories that they're telling that they fit into. And in terms of political education, if we're going to make any change in this country, obviously we need to focus on uniting people on class interests, because that is the widest, you know, that's the widest point of common interest, is the fact that we're all workers, most of us, you know, and we have to sell our labour to survive, and that's what unites us. However, that's not the ethos of all of these protest movements. So on the one hand, you've got things like Palestine Action, which I fully support because they're having a very tangible impact on Elbit systems in the UK and their ability to operate. I also, as we've been discussing, I think if we're going to be prosperous, we need a new foreign policy that isn't focused on wars, and they're definitely contributing to that. So that we have more peace and trade agreements rather than imposing regimes from above through bombs. But on the other hand, there are a couple of groups in the UK, at least, who aren't actually focused on socialism or class interests, but are quite happy and willing to work with what we would, as socialists, consider to be the class enemy, which is, billionaires, and even to an extent, organisations linked to the state, and that is Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. And I've been doing a bit of research into these organisations. I don't know why exactly, I tend to fall down rabbit holes with this kind of stuff. But I was looking at Extinction Rebellion's financial records the other day, just out of interest. It's all public domain stuff. And I saw that in 2019, they received over £100,000 grant from an organisation, an NGO, non-governmental organisation called the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Now, this is a partner of the British government in terms of overseas work and access and in relation to climate change, but it also promotes Western interests in places like China through using climate change as their point of kind of entry. And the CEO of that is a former British government advisor and also works in another kind of think tank, which is all about increasing the access of Western NGOs to the Chinese economy. So you've got these organizations that are getting funding from foundations that are actually working in partnership with the British government, and these foundations are set up by billionaires. In the case of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, the person who established that is a guy named Chris Hon, and he has investments in Heathrow Airport, which is bizarre. With regards to Just Stop Oil, they receive money from the Climate Emergency Fund, which was set up by three very wealthy people, one of whom is this guy called Trevor Nielsen, who is a former member of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is this big CIA-backed US think tank, and he's currently running a business with two former CIA officers. So these organizations actually have quite strong financial links to the establishment. And they are not promoting class interests, because if you look at what Just Stop Oil's been doing in terms of blocking the M25, what they're actually doing is irritating people trying to get to work, to and from work. And whether or not this is the intention, what it is doing is driving a wedge between protest movements, or the concept of a protest movement, and ordinary people, just as this legislation is going through Parliament. And these organizations don't actually have a class basis. They're completely different to, say, trade unions, which have a very practical role in representing workplace rights and trying to get changes in the workplace. And even something like Palestine Action, which is having a practical impact on Elbit systems in the UK. These groups, frankly, as far as I can tell, are just annoying a lot of people. I mean, they do have support, but they don't actually have wide support. And yet they're being promoted in the establishment media. So although we can't say exactly what's going on there, to my mind, something is a bit off. And so
I mean, what do you put that down to? I mean, obviously, I suspect that the rank and file members of those organisations are genuine and well-meaning, and they're not nefarious in any way, shape, or form. But it's somehow the people that perhaps somehow get to the top of organisations somehow maybe go wrong, or maybe they always were wrong. I don't know. What do you put this down to? I mean, is it infiltration by manipulation by the ruling class, or what?
I don't know. I mean, my assumption is that obviously money is something that will always impact on action, regardless of intent. And I think if you are part of the establishment and you want to have an influence in progressive movements, you can buy into them, can't you? That's that's one way of getting influence and shaping things, is to fund them. And I think that is what's definitely happening. How much influence that is buying, if any, I'm not 100% sure. But like I say, it is interesting that Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, they're not socialist, explicitly not socialist. In fact, the funding model that backs Just Stop Oil is it's explicitly based on venture capitalism. So these organisations, it's not in their interest to promote class solidarity and the uniting of the working class, because that would affect their money coming in. They're not able to do it and retain the investment from what are very capitalist ruling class financial backers. And so on the one hand, so in terms of political education, we just need to be really careful about which organisations we're talking about and talking up in relation to this legislation. And obviously trade unions, brilliant, yes. And also anti-imperialist kind of internationalist groups that are trying to shift British foreign policy in a way that will actually improve the economic situation for all of us. And if I think we have those twin pressures, so you've got working class people uniting around their economic interests in the workplace, and there is also an internationalist movement trying to shift foreign policy away from wars and towards mutual respect between countries, Britain and also countries that have perhaps more natural resources that we need, then that's the way to go, rather than these environmental, because I do support a clean environment and animal rights and all that, but a lot of these environmental groups also, they are backed by organisations that have an imperialist agenda too across the world, so opening up China, economic interests there. These aren't organisations that are going to build working class solidarity at home and abroad. And I think that really needs to be our focus, and we need to be very clear about who we're supporting and why we're supporting them. And otherwise we'll end up where we are now, which is a fragmented working class base, and protest movements that have served to fragment that base.
I mean, perhaps in conclusion then, the last 40 years we've seen the dominance of the kind of, well, more than 40 years actually, and over 40, I mean, well, it's 1976 really, the kind of dominance of neoliberal, monetarist economics. That's also coincided with an emphasis on identity politics and the demise of class politics. And I guess what you're saying, isn't it, that we need to maybe pay less attention to identity politics and prioritize, resurgence of class politics?
It's not about kind of sort of overlooking diversity, but it's just focusing on what we have in common and our common interests and what unites us as humanity and as as a class. And like you said earlier, was it Ian? I can't remember which one of you said it, but we have far more in common with the people coming here on boats, far more in common.
Yes, that was my point I was making,
than we do with the big money capitalists who are actually funding groups like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. We need to unite as ordinary people and as a class. So the interests of politicians and trying to win over big money, much less important because of the numbers and what pressure that can achieve. And we're going to face some very hard times in the next few years. So we need to build a bigger movement as possible. And that requires mobilizing the working class. I think there is a bit of an issue though in terms of education and why this kind of is important, because I've been speaking to various people on the picket lines, and also just like some people I know in politics, and one of the things they're saying is a lot of people who are going on strike don't actually know that they don't get paid while they're on strike. There's all sorts of
I know that.
They just don't understand what's going on. And so because of this 40 and more years of neoliberalism, the idea of class solidarity and socialism it's kind of been cast to the wayside a bit. And we really now need to do a lot of effort to bring it back into the forefront.
Well, we're certainly endeavouring to do that. as far as the Socialist Labour Party is concerned, that Resist is now joined forces with, and I know you're with the Workers' Party. We're collaborating on the No to NATO, No to War campaign. And I think that's the future. We've got to, the left has got to collaborate and work together. But I think we'll wrap it there, Phil, because unfortunately Sean's poorly tonight. So if you're watching Sean, if you're watching Sean, get well soon.
Get well soon, yeah.
So we won't be able to have any Q&As from our audience this evening, but you've put forward some very, I think, thought-provoking propositions in the latter part of the program there, where you talk about some of these environmental groups, which I think would probably be, people will have heard that before. So I would be quite interested actually to see what people are saying in the chat, but I actually can't see that. So maybe that's something that we perhaps need to return to, in a future program. But listen, thanks, Phil, for coming on this evening. I think it's been a useful and interesting conversation, and it was good to get Ian Hodson's thoughts as well. And thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. We're going to call it a night now. Tune in next week at the same time, 7 o'clock, and we'll be back with another Resistance TV. Until then, thank you for watching, and good night.